Good afternoon, and welcome to UCF Coastal's Lunch on the Coast speaker series. I'm Dr. Graham Worthy, Director of UCF Coastal. Through this speaker series, I hope you gain appreciation for the extent of basic and applied coastal research underway here at UCF. Orlando may be an inland city, but we still contribute to the issues facing our coast, and are in turn impacted by those same issues. One of the goals of UCF Coastal is to grow public awareness about the amazing coastal resources we frequently take for granted. To achieve that goal, we've assembled an incredible team of cutting-edge researchers who serve as a resource for everyone from marine scientists to the general public, businesses, and policymakers. Our Lunch on the Coast speaker series is running from July through December, with one speaker each month. Through this series, we're proud to highlight some of the recent research undertaken by the diverse interdisciplinary faculty of UCF Coastal. You'll learn what it really means to live in a coastal state, with expert perspectives ranging from archaeology to coastal planning, from engineering and economics to ecosystem and human health. You'll get an appreciation for the full range of issues currently facing our coasts and the resources that UCF Coastal is bringing to bear to help foster an understanding of those threats and hopefully chart a path forward. Now let me pass you over to our moderator, who will be introducing you to this month's speaker, and we'll also be running our question and answer session following the talk. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the Lunch on the Coast speaker series.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Emmerich, UCF Coastal's Director of Research, and I'm here as your moderator for today's Lunch on the Coast speaker series. It is my great honor to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Kelly Kibler. Dr. Kibler is an assistant professor of water resources engineering at UCF's Department of Civil, Environmental, and Construction Engineering, and she's an affiliate member of UCF Coastal. Dr. Kibler's particular interest in waterway human interactions is just one of her many specialties at the crossroads of engineering and ecology. Today, Dr. Kibler will be introducing us to the topic of living coastlines as a way to help us adapt to and mitigate the effects of changing coastal conditions. This short video provides just a glimpse into Dr. Kibler's research on coastal systems.
My name is Kelly Kibler and I study ecohydraulics. There's a lot we can learn with lab work, but we need to ground everything we do with observation in the true aquatic ecosystem. That's our most interesting question, is when the flow hits these mangrove roots, it changes, and the way that it moves sediment changes. So the problem that we study usually is shoreline erosion, and that's the removal of sediment away from the shoreline. The water then becomes deeper next to the shoreline, it's able to erode even more and more and more. And if you have a property right there on the water, that's a concern to you as a landowner. So what we want to know is, how can a landowner protect their property and stop their property from eroding without having to put a hard structure like a seawall or a revetment or some kind of like rock structure on the shoreline? So if we can learn about the way that vegetation like mangrove interacts with moving water and moving sediments, we can apply it to infrastructure on the coastline directly in front of people's properties or assets that we want to protect from shoreline erosion. And this technique is called living shoreline. So it's kind of an option that is not putting a hard structural seawall on the shoreline, but instead using natural materials like vegetation, like oysters, to try and change the shoreline ecotone. It not only prevents erosion, but it also is associated with a lot of really good benefits to our water bodies. Things like cycling of nutrients and carbon, storage of carbon, which of course is important from a climate perspective. So habitat creation, biodiversity. There are so many good benefits to having good intact shoreline ecotones. Only one of them is that they don't erode the same way that bare or seawall shorelines would.
Thank you for that introductory video. Should you have any questions or comments during Dr. Kibler's presentation, please use the QA button located at the bottom of the presentation panel. Here you can ask questions that we will cover during the latter part of lunch, the dessert or the interaction with Kelly one-on-one with questions. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Kelly Kibler. Kelly, take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this webinar. And thanks for the great introduction, Chris and everyone. My name is Dr. Kelly Kibler. I'm an associate professor in water resources engineering in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Construction Engineering at UCF. And the title of my talk, What's a Beach Picnic Without Sand, is chosen because I'm going to be talking today about sediment, which includes sand, but also includes particles that are larger than sand, like shell or gravel, and also those that are smaller than sand, like silt or organic matter. So these materials literally are our coasts, right? They're the earth on which our coastal systems are built. And these materials are not designed to stay in one place, right? We don't build our foundations into sand because the sand moves. So I study those processes that move sand, and especially the alive parts of the coastal ecosystem, like vegetations or reefs, and how this influences the movement of the sediments. So coastal sediments are often moved by moving water. There we go. Or hydrodynamics, the movement of water. And so the more kind of sciencey title of my talk is how multi-scale hydrodynamics are influenced by biota to shape coastal environments. And here's where we're going to go over the course of this talk. So my research specialty is called ecohydraulics, and this is a term that really needs some explanation. So I'm going to start with a basic introduction to ecohydraulics research. And then the rest of my talk is going to be focused on living infrastructure and how the study of ecohydraulics can inform the design of green infrastructure for the purpose of coastal defenses. So I'll be covering some of these following research questions. So how do complex biological canopies alter flows? And then turning that around, how do flows shape the living parts of the aquatic ecosystem? And then we'll be looking into some more kind of applied coastal defense questions about restoration of coastal habitats and then the creation of nature-based features. So as an introduction to ecohydraulics, ecohydraulics is an interdisciplinary study of coupled physical and biological variables in aquatic systems, both natural and engineered. So it's this very interdisciplinary look at traditional earth sciences of hydrology and hydraulics, the mechanisms of sediment transport and geomorphology, and then ecosystem-based sciences. So as an engineer, my training is really in the physical and earth sciences, but I work really closely with a number of biologists and ecologists, especially through the UCF's Coastal Center. So I've put together for you a little slideshow of some of my past ecohydraulics research, which has been really highly varied. So I've been fortunate enough to work in a lot of different amazing aquatic systems, including freshwater and saltwater ecosystems, steep mountain rivers in the Himalayan foothills, and really low gradient estuaries, like the ones that you saw in the video. I have worked in tiny catchments, so headwater streams that are home to spawning salmon in the Pacific Northwest, but also are surrounded by working timberland. I have worked in large international rivers, including the Mekong River and the Salween River in Southeast Asia, and the Ganges-Brahmaputra-Meghna system in South Asia. I have worked in a lot of water bodies that are permanently containing water, so perennial rivers, but I've also worked in seasonally flooded wetlands systems, such as the Candaba wetlands of the Philippines, which you can see here. So ecohydraulics research can really be done anywhere that moving water touches something alive, which basically describes the natural state of most aquatic ecosystems. So all of my research has two things in common. It's always about moving water touching something alive. And then I'm always seeking answers to questions about how humans should manage their natural ecosystems to provide for maximum ecosystem services, or the benefits to humans that come from intact functional ecosystems. So this work in the Candaba, Philippines is a good example of this. This middle picture here that looks like an inland lake is actually a seasonal floodplain wetland. So during the dry season, much of this land is not underwater and it's instead farmed. It supports a couple of rice crops, rain-fed rice crops per year. And then during the wet season, the land is inundated. And that seasonal inundation supports a really productive inland fishery because the river fish can now access nutrients and habitats within the extensive floodplain wetland system. So this seasonal fishery is an economic commodity, right? The fish are marketed. And in addition to this income for the area, the fishery also provides essential protein at the household level. So choices in managing the hydrology of this area could include to regulate the flows and stop this seasonal inundation. And this could allow the region to produce up to 3 rice crops per year instead of 2. But then it would come at the loss of some of these aquatic ecosystem services that support the fishery, as well as the soil's fertility and the soil moisture that's provided by that seasonal inundation. So these are the types of questions that I tend to seek out in my research, challenges that are related to providing food, water, and energy to a world that is both growing and also changing really rapidly. So in the face of these large-scale global challenges, UCF is training engineers to see these challenges as opportunities. So innovation is really going to be key to meeting some of these global sustainability challenges. And the specific innovation I want to discuss today is related to rethinking parts of our coastal infrastructure, and especially the parts that serve as defenses against extreme conditions, such as during high wind events or heavy rainfall or storm surges. So just as we heard in the last talk in this series, given by Dr. Claire Knox, payments from private insurers and governments that are related to the recovery from disasters are growing exponentially. And we know that this is because the risk of disasters is growing. And we understand that risk is a function of the probability that some event is going to occur, and then the consequences that are going to follow if that event occurs. And there's a really solid body of scientific evidence that's pointing to increasing probabilities of hazards as the climate warms. But it's also important to note that natural hazards themselves are not a cause of disasters. So for example, we've just had a really long-lived major hurricane out in the Atlantic, Hurricane Sam. But the damages that were associated with this storm were really negligible because the storm stayed out over the ocean and few human assets were exposed to the extreme hazard of the storm. So increasing human exposure to areas that are likely to experience hazards, like coastal areas, this is really a large factor in the rising risk of disasters. So it's kind of a perfect storm that as the climate is changing and sea level rise is happening, and it's increasing the probabilities of more and more extreme coastal hazards, a lot of humans have kind of simultaneously decided that they are going to go and live and build in coastal areas. So we have this concentration of human lives and wealth in increasingly hazardous areas. So climate change is certainly a part of it, but it's important to understand that changing exposure due to human decision-making is also a really big part of this equation as well. So we can think about mitigating risk by limiting exposure, right? So this would be a strategy of something like managed retreat, abstaining from further development on the coast, removal of assets into inland areas. But the truth is that people are not ready to do this. They don't want to do this. So if we look at our risk equation and start to think about, is there another strategy that we can employ that humans may be able to accept more readily? Our risk equation tells us that exposure is not necessarily synonymous with damages. So humans have the ability to influence our vulnerability or susceptibility to hazard exposure and as a way of mitigating risk. So our best strategy may be to try and prevent damages from occurring by increasing the capacity of our society to be exposed to hazardous conditions, yet sustain low levels of damages. And so this is where we start to develop interest in infrastructure to increase our capacity to cope with hazardous exposures. And when I say infrastructure, Most people think about roads and bridges right away. And if I say coastal defensive infrastructure, most picture hardened structures along the coastline, like seawalls or tide gates. But by contrast, the term natural infrastructure acknowledges the vital structural role that natural aquatic ecosystems fulfill in lowering the risks of climate-related hazards. And so I want to emphasize just right off that natural infrastructure also provides other essential ecosystem services like carbon and nutrient cycling, habitat provision for biodiversity. I'm not going to be addressing some of these services in this talk because others in this series will be talking about this. So today I'm just going to focus on the defensive services of natural infrastructure. So just a little bit of vocabulary that we need to learn in the topic of natural infrastructure. Natural infrastructure refers to intact or restored systems like wetlands or forests or reefs, whereas nature-based approaches are designed to mimic natural systems, but they are designed and constructed by humans. Both benefit society by lowering the risks of climate-related hazards, as well as providing all of those other beneficial ecosystem services. So natural and nature-based features, sometimes abbreviated NNBF, can be equally or more effective than conventional structural approaches to infrastructure and can often be more cost-effective. So you may hear a lot of terms that describe natural infrastructure: ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem disaster risk reduction, building with nature or nature-based design. So all of these things are conveying similar ideas. As an engineer, the framing of natural infrastructure, it makes a lot of sense to me as it allows for some good compelling comparisons to be made between the cost and performance of natural infrastructure as opposed to the traditional engineered solutions, which are often termed gray infrastructure. So there are definitely some clear advantages to natural infrastructure when we make these comparisons. So number one, nature-based designs harness the power of evolutionary experience. So because healthy and intact ecosystems are adapted to natural disturbance patterns, they have the capacity to withstand or recover from, or even become stronger from climate-related variability. So even highly intelligently designed traditional gray engineered structures don't have this ability. Number two, natural infrastructure has the ability to adjust as environmental conditions change. So sea level rise is a really good example of this. So I have seen evidence while doing fieldwork in Florida around the time of Hurricane Irma that the extreme water levels that happened during the hurricane led to about a 4-inch accretion of sand within a mangrove forest that my group was studying at the time on the shoreline of Mosquito Lagoon. So in that experience, it was like watching the wetland take advantage of the storm to build itself up, make itself more resilient to future changes. And somebody who heard this story told me, wow, it's almost like the wetland is doing that job of workers filling and stacking sandbags for us. And that's exactly the right idea. So by contrast, gray infrastructural approaches are built at one static elevation. And as the water level goes up around them, the design elevation of those structures, it can't change, it can't adapt the way that living infrastructure could. Okay, so finally, natural infrastructure, if it's well designed and appropriate for the surrounding conditions, it should maintain itself and with basically an unlimited design life, right? It should be able to make use of natural processes of recruitment and ecosystem renewal, whereas conventional gray infrastructure is going to have a finite design life and is going to require ongoing maintenance throughout that life and may need costly repairs when it's damaged. So, are you convinced? Are you ready to go out and build a bunch of this natural infrastructure everywhere? And if you are, you're not alone. There has been a veritable explosion in interest of natural infrastructure over the past couple of decades. And my evidence of this is the multi-billion, with a B, dollar industries that have popped up around things like river restoration, wetland restoration, mitigation banking, low impact development and nature-based stormwater management strategies, living shoreline stabilization, mangrove restoration, and reef creation for coastal defenses. So really big industrial potential for all of these types of infrastructure systems. But as it turns out, design with living materials can be really challenging. So living organisms are alive, and sometimes they don't stay where you put them. Sometimes they don't grow where it would be most convenient for humans. So they're subject to really annoying ecological processes like predation and competition, right? These are just problems that we don't have with concrete. And as well as scientists understand ecology of some of these key ecosystem engineers that are used to create natural infrastructure. So here I've got for you a few examples of species that would be appropriate design tools for coastal infrastructure in Florida. We still have some major gaps in understanding that need to be addressed before we can really design effectively with these living organisms. It almost requires a material science approach to sort out the properties of each of these species that pertain to the design. And so that brings us to our major research questions. And as we go through some of these major research areas, I'm just going to present some vignettes of some of the many studies that my lab has done in trying to address some of these fundamental questions. Most of our research involves some combination of field measurements, modeling, and laboratory analysis. So I just put together a little bit of a slideshow about some of our methods. As I mentioned, one of our primary research questions is to try and decipher exactly how a biological canopy like oysters on a reef influences the local flow environment. And so our field hydrodynamic experiments often look something like this photo on the right. So here in the channel, we've got a cluster of instruments that are measuring a number of hydrodynamic parameters. Velocity, so how fast the water is moving in the channel, how big the waves are, how fast the wind is blowing and in what direction, and how deep the water is. And then over here within the canopy, in this case, it's an oyster reef canopy, we're measuring similar flow parameters. So the flow speed, the depth, the waves, and then the difference between what we observe in the channel and what we observe in the canopy, this is the effect of the reef. So for instance, in this experiment, we might be measuring how reefs attenuate flow and waves. And we might sample multiple locations of the canopy, like you can see in this cartoon on the bottom. So that little spaceship looking thing, that's kind of one of our velocity probes that we use within canopies. And then at the bottom, you can see the oysters. So we may, for instance, measure velocity within the canopy close to the bed or just above it, because we'll see different characteristic flow signatures as the flow interacts with both the bed and with the canopy. So the canopies that we study are diverse. So this is what hydrodynamics research looks like inside of a mangrove forest, a little bit of a hot mess. As you can imagine, we spend a good bit of time measuring things and counting things, right? We have to make organization and numbers out of that chaos of mangrove roots. We have to be able to know what exactly has created the flow patterns that we measure with our instruments. So sometimes this measuring and counting stuff part can get really tedious. So sometimes we try to develop new ways to use technology that can get us out of having to count and measure things by hand. So here, for example, we're kind of piloting using laser scanning to estimate the roughness of the surface of an oyster reef. So after taking laser scans in the field, we can process the raw point cloud of the scan and analyze these 3D images to come up with parameters of things like canopy height and how it varies over the reef, or the proportion of volume above the reef that is composed of solid oyster canopy as opposed to water. We also do a fair bit of sediment characterization. We take samples of sediments from the field back to our lab and figure out how big they are, how much organic matter is within the sediment. And we also might do a lot of survey work to monitor how the elevation of our study sites change over time. So if the elevation of a site goes up over time, this is indicating that more sediments have been deposited in that site than have been eroded. And if the elevation goes down over time, that's telling us that the site is eroding. So here we go. Let's look at some data. So the first research question that we're addressing is, how do complex biological canopies alter flows? The first case that I'm going to present is the case of emergent vegetation. So here we've got 3 different sites, data from 3 sites that we're looking at. On the left-hand side, there's a plot that gives us kind of the flow speed within the channel. And then on the y-axis, we've got flow speed close to the shoreline. And 2 of our sites have vegetation. The black and the red points are the ones that are in vegetation. The black vegetation has been restored. So this is a living shoreline restoration site. The vegetation is kind of young mangrove that were planted and smooth cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora. And then the red points come from a mature mangrove forest. Meanwhile, those blue points are showing us what happens to the flow when there's no vegetation present. So as the flow speed in the channel becomes faster and faster, the flow speed near the shoreline in the vegetated sites stays really low. Whereas in the bare sediment site with no vegetation next to the seawall, the flow still speeds up. So we can conclude that vegetation slows the flow down, right? This makes sense. As the flow comes into a canopy of vegetation, a lot of the kinetic energy, the speed of that flow, is being converted by a drag against the solid elements of the canopy. So this is something that we would expect to see in almost any vegetated site. If we look at the way that waves are attenuated, we see a similar kind of a story. So within the two vegetated sites, we've got wave attenuation on the order of about 30%, whereas at the bare sediment site, very little attenuation of the wave. All right, case number 2. Now we're going to look at a different type of canopy, a submerged canopy. So the vegetation was extending through the entire water column. The oyster is completely submerged within the water. So some of the flow can go up and over the canopy. So here we're looking at flow attenuation at 2 different positions within the canopy. On the right, kind of close to the bed within the canopy, on the left, above the canopy. In either case, we see that the flow is being attenuated from the channel to the reef. So again, just like vegetation, reefs are slowing down the flow. We can even get more to the point and look at how the actual oysters on the reef are slowing the flow down. So here, we've got velocity profiles in a time series over 2 different types of reef. One, on the right-hand side, is degraded. It has no live oyster, no canopy. It's just the reef structure itself that has eventually, over time, become degraded. On the left-hand side, we see the same data coming from a mature oyster canopy. So as you move further away from the bed, the really dark blue areas where nothing is moving, that's kind of where the sediment is. The flow speeds up much faster over the degraded reef than it does over the mature oyster canopy. So this is indicating to us the effect of the actual oysters on slowing the flow down. All right, the third case, we're looking at another submerged canopy, this time of seagrasses. And so seagrasses, like oysters, are fully submerged within the flow. So a portion of the flow can go up and over the canopy, while another portion goes through the canopy. Unlike oysters, seagrasses are really flexible, right? So they're going to flex and bend as the flow moves them. And in this case, we're seeing, one of the joys of field research is when something doesn't go as planned, we don't see what we thought we were going to see in the data, right? This is why it's really important to actually go and measure it in the field. So here again, we're looking at 3 different sites. One site has no seagrass on it at all. It's just the bare sediment. It's on the far right. The middle is a site that is covered by seagrass with about 40% cover, a density of about 2,500 blades per square meter. And here we see that the attenuation of flow from the channel is greater in this sparse seagrass site than in the bare sediment site. That's what we expect to see. Again, the conversion of the kinetic energy of the flow against the vegetation slowing the flow down. So we've gone from about a 50% attenuation on the bare sediment to about a 70% in the sparse site. But then we've also monitored a site that has a much greater density of seagrass blades per square meter. And here we would expect to see even more attenuation of the flow. And instead we see that it's actually accelerating the flow as compared to the bare sediment. So when you or I look out at a seagrass bed, we may see a nice uniform distribution of vegetation across the bed, but flow is able to find and exploit the heterogeneity, the patchiness of that flow, of that seagrass bed. So it's able to wind its way in and around and find the preferential flow paths. And so we happen to be measuring right in a preferential flow path where the flow was being accelerated around particularly dense patches of seagrass. That's what we think has happened with these data. So our conclusion here is that seagrasses slow the flow sometimes, except when they don't. So in all of the examples I've been showing you, we've been looking at the mean flow speed. But I want to talk about another parameter that we look at that gives us a little bit more insight into what is happening within the hydrodynamics. So we look at the structure of turbulence. So here I've got a couple of time series, 2-minute time series of flow on oyster reefs. The top is a mature oyster canopy and the bottom is a canopy that was restored recently. I think these data were collected about a year after restoration. And in these two time series, the mean flow is the same, about 10 centimeters per second. But you'll see that the distribution of velocities around that mean look different in the two sites, right? So if we look at the standard deviations, for instance, we see that the mature oyster canopy has a higher variance of flow around that mean, indicating a different turbulence structure. Now, turbulence may be incredibly important to the transport of sediments. So here we have some data. This is a postdoctoral researcher in my lab, Dr. David Cannon, and he is placing a turbidity sensor within a dense patch of mature mangrove vegetation. And here are some data that he collected over about 2 weeks' time. On the top, we've got the flow speed. You can see the flow speed goes up and down with the tidal pulse. The middle graph is showing you the wave heights. And then the bottom is how much sediment is in the water column. So this is what the turbidity sensor shows us. A couple of things that we learned from looking at these data, they're still fairly preliminary, but we can see that there's definitely a strong correlation between how much sediment is moving in the water column and how big the waves are, right? So the waves are really kind of the dominant transport mechanism at this particular site. And then we've got two turbidity sensors. One is in a really dense area of mangrove and one is in a slightly less dense area, a sparse site. And what we think that we're seeing here is more suspended sediment concentration in the dense vegetation as opposed to the sparse vegetation, right? So our hypothesis here is that the change in turbulence signature between the two different canopies is causing greater potential for sediment transport. We're still trying to vet these data out a little bit. And it's a very complicated question because sediment transport is related both to the flow speed, which as we've already discussed is very much related to the canopy characteristics, but it's also related to the structure of turbulence created by the flow interaction with the canopy. So trying to untangle this with field data is definitely an interesting project. Okay, so now I'm going to go to our next big research question. So how do the flows shape the living environment? So the first case study I'm going to show you here is one related to determining hydrodynamic thresholds for vegetation, for mangrove vegetation. So this is a project that was done with collaboration from Dr. Melinda Donnelly and Dr. Linda Walters in the biology department. And here we undertook a field survey of about 375 miles of shoreline and combined this with hydrodynamic modeling in order to answer the question, when does a hydrodynamic environment become so severe that mangrove can no longer persist in a given site? And so what we find here is that there's a pretty sharp break-off point when the 80th percentile wave height at a site goes above about 8 centimeters. That's the point at which it becomes increasingly unlikely that you are going to find mangrove vegetation on that site. And so using that information, we can now predict where mangrove are likely to persist based solely on wave climate, right? This was a kind of beyond my wildest dreams result of this study because so many variables influence where a living organism is going to live. Light, temperature, salinity, slope, these are all variables that are going to affect where you might find mangrove vegetation. So to be able to find a hydrodynamic threshold within all of that variability was really amazing. And we can use this information in the design of robust shoreline stabilization projects. So for instance, we can target, if we know that a certain site is a priority for restoration, we can now use this information to know if mangrove vegetation is going to be an appropriate method for stabilizing that site. Okay, so the next case study that I want to share about how flows shape the living environment is the question about how boat wakes impact shoreline erosion. So this question came up based on kind of our experience doing field research. This is data that we collected one afternoon on a shoreline of Mosquito Lagoon. All of the red circles. So here we've got time on the x-axis in minutes and on the y-axis wave heights. And anywhere you see a red circle, this was a peak in wave activity that was created by a passing recreational boat. And all the green circles down here at the bottom are the ambient conditions that are driven by the wind. So when we look at something like this, we start thinking about, wow, you know, these boat wakes are really big compared to the wind waves, and they happen really, really frequently. Could these be agents of erosion within our study sites? And so we commissioned a study on this, and this is a video that was put together by one of my undergraduate researchers about boat wakes in our study site. So here you're looking at the ambient wind conditions, the waves that are generated by wind, and then a boat goes by about 50 meters away. And now you can see the way that the waves are changing because the wake that is created by the boat produces a wave that is somewhat different from the waves that are produced naturally by wind. And so we wanted to know a little bit more about this. And so we designed a small study and asked this question of the data. One thing we were really interested in is if the boat goes by really close to the shore, like that 50-meter boat pass that you saw in the video, does it make a difference if the boat was further away, right? Because at some point you would expect that the wake is going to decay as the further the boat is away from the shoreline. So a boat passing really far from the shoreline maybe wouldn't matter from the perspective of shoreline erosion. But what we found actually is that wakes that were generated further offshore were actually able to create greater shear stresses. So impart more energy to the shoreline. And then when we compared wake energy to ambient wind-driven waves and their ability to pick up different size classes of sediments on the shoreline, what we found is that these maximum and minimum boat wakes were so much larger than the ambient condition that they were able to carry a much larger proportion of the sediment size classes on the shoreline. So absolutely, confirm that boat wakes even generated from 200 meters offshore can definitely be agents of erosion if they occur frequently enough. Okay, so now here we're getting more into some of the applied questions of restoration and creation of coastal habitats. So my example of restoration of coastal habitats is oyster reef restoration in the Indian River Lagoon. So here we collaborated with Dr. Linda Walters and her group. Dr. Walters runs a very successful oyster reef restoration program in the IRL. So here's what reefs look like before, during, and after restoration. We wanted to know hydrodynamically, what do they look like? And it turns out that just the process of restoration itself, by taking a degraded reef and bringing it back down into the elevation of a live reef, really is doing a lot of the work for us by recreating kind of the hydrodynamics over the reef. But even when we were able to dig a little bit further into the data and look at things like the turbulence characteristics, what we found is that the turbulence characteristics of restored reefs look really similar to the reference reef, and it happens really soon after restoration. So for instance, these are data that are coming just 1 month after restoration, comparing our blue, which is the restored reef, to the green reef, to the kind of a reference natural reef. So even 1 month after, we're seeing turbulence characteristics that are pretty similar. And then it just gets better over time as more and more oysters are recruited. The second example I want to share is one of the creation of a nature-based feature, an oyster reef, for the purpose of shoreline protection. So this is a project that is done in collaboration with other UCF biology faculty, Dr. Melinda Donnelly and Dr. Lisa Chambers. So in this project, we constructed structures of bagged oyster shell and deployed these along a shoreline to see if these could function to kind of raise the elevation of the shoreline by collecting sediments. So over 3 years, we documented change to hydrodynamics, sediment movement, and then the microbial vegetation and invertebrate communities, including oyster. And what we found after 3 years is that there was a net gain of sediment across all of the sites. Almost all of these sediments were deposited in the vicinity of the structures. So here, anywhere that you see red on these figures, these are areas where sediment has been accumulating. And you're looking at maximum accumulations here of half a meter of sediment in some places. Anywhere you see low, these are places, or anywhere you see blue, these are places where sediment has been removed from the shoreline. We have not seen a whole lot of oyster recruitment, however, on the structures, which brings up the real difficulty of creating nature-based features. Restoring function to an area that has been degraded for whatever reason is a lot easier than trying to create a feature where it has maybe historically never existed. So there's a big challenge in the creation of nature-based features for coastal defense. So here's an example of, at that same site, wave attenuation. So we're really not seeing that these created oyster reefs are attenuating waves any better than areas of the shoreline that don't have the structures. And so this brings me to a new project that's going to be hopefully beginning in early of 2022. It's still kind of in the contracting phase. So this is a project funded by DARPA. So the Department of Defense of the US government has a number of military installations all over the world that are at risk of flooding and coastal erosion. And so they want to create some new technologies for coastal defenses using natural infrastructure. So the organism that we are going to be applying in this project is oyster. And our objective here is to create a mosaic habitat that supports a viable oyster population and attenuates waves to protect coastal infrastructures. So this is kind of a little bit of a map of what we're planning to do throughout this project. But again, it's going to be an extreme challenge because it is the creation of an entire ecosystem designed for coastal defense, but also made of things that are alive and need to be kept alive in a place that maybe didn't have oysters before. So this is going to be a major challenge. All right, so I'm going to leave you with a few just concluding remarks. So number one, that natural infrastructure holds a lot of promise in the area of coastal defenses. And there are really some truly compelling advantages of using natural infrastructure over traditional gray infrastructure. However, we still have a really sizable gap in knowledge that has to be overcome. So this just reflects that this industry is really just in its infancy. We're really just starting the process of trying to learn about building with nature and nature-based design. So ecohydraulics research certainly can assist in the robust design of green infrastructure by building up that material science approach that is needed to design with living organisms. But one thing to keep in mind is that the scale of natural infrastructure, it really has to be viewed differently than what we view in traditional infrastructure. If you replace the same footprint of gray infrastructure with green infrastructure, you may not get the same effectiveness. It really takes more of a landscape scale approach as opposed to a project site approach in order to be effective and cost effective as well. All right, so at this time, I would like to acknowledge the very, very many people who have contributed to the research that I've been able to present to you today. So my key collaborators are listed here, including students, postdocs, and folks at UCF and not at UCF who have contributed to this work, and especially the students of the Kibler Ecohydraulics Laboratory. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the sources of funding that brought you the research that you saw today, mostly the National Science Foundation, the EPA's Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, and NOAA. And thank you, of course, to UCF Coastal. And so thank you again for joining the webinar, and I'm really happy to take all of your questions now. And if there isn't time or you don't think of your questions quickly enough, then you can always contact me. Feel free to email me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kelly, again for such great information about so many real world things that pass through boaters' minds and people who live in the coast minds all the time. We have several questions. I will do my best with a little bit of artistic liberty in taking the questions that came into the chat and combining them in certain ways. There are a few questions that got upvoted, including one from Rob Persons, who asks, how long does it take for practical hardening techniques you're investigating, and I would say others as well, maybe if you know, to turn into real protecting infrastructure? Are you seeing real world improvements based on the research you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. At the site scale, I would say, when it comes to vegetation, sometimes it can take a couple of years. In Florida, we've got this long growing season, so we may be fortunate to see, protective function from planted vegetation that takes place almost, right away, within a year, 2 years. When it came to the oyster reef restoration, literally the biggest impacts that we saw happened immediately from the moment that the reef profile was lowered to its correct elevation. But it's a good point. Like, it can definitely take a while before we can realize some of the kind of long-term and sustained benefits.
Well, thank you for that answer. Several people were interested in anything you could tell us about coastal defenses to saltwater intrusion.
Oh man, yeah. I'm not really certain that there's a great solution there, to be honest. I think that's a problem of a different color.
Certainly not related to sediments and very linked with the cheesy, literally, limestone infrastructure, geology that we have here. A question about boat wakes I found to be very interesting. How do you explain the lack of decay and energy of boat wakes from further away compared to boats that pass more closely? Did you say that wakes from further away were actually stronger or created more shear stress?
Yeah, great question. This blew our minds too, right? It's not what we expected to see. So I think the answer to this question is that the theory is going to hold, right? If you go far enough away and, if a wake is generated from 1 kilometer away, let's say, we probably are going to see the decay just like, the theory would predict. More than likely, what has happened is that we're looking kind of for that sweet spot, right? And so what may be happening is that as we move further away from the shoreline, we may see the impact go up before it goes down, right? So we need to do a little bit more detailed study and obviously move our far away boat wakes even further out to see at what point we can see what the theory would predict in terms of the decay. So
follow on to that.
Yeah.
Did you create the boat wakes or were these from other passing boats?
Yeah, we created them because it was within, we wanted to keep it within an experimental context. So we needed to know exactly how far away we were from the shore and things like that. However, I will say anecdotally that there was a boat that passed while we were recording during this study. I don't know how far away it was, but it was much more than 200 meters away. Let's say 0.5 kilometer. And yeah, we saw that wake in our data. Yeah.
Quite interesting. More questions are flowing in. I'm trying to capture them as we go. There is a question outstanding. I think you did cover it later on, but perhaps maybe touch on it again. Mm-hmm. Are you studying areas with both seawall and vegetation? Essentially, how do you study these things interchangeably? And they followed on by saying it looked like there were some from the points on some of your graphs, but if maybe touch on that a little.
Yeah, so the data that I showed you today were either or, right? There was either a seawall and no vegetation or there was vegetation and no seawall, right? So we were able to separate out the effects of vegetation versus no vegetation. However, I mean, I can pretty much understand where this question is coming from, because there's a ton of interest in creating hybrid infrastructure that combines, you know, the hard structural approach of great infrastructure with some of the ecosystem benefits that come from including living organisms in the infrastructure design. So we call these hybrid systems. We have not directly been studying the hydrodynamics of hybrid systems. So we've mainly been looking at the purely natural designs, but it certainly is something that has a lot of interest, because a lot of homeowners in particular are a little bit nervous about giving up their hard structural engineered approach and planting some vegetation instead. And I would say that's with good reason, right? Because again, we can't have this idea that we can take the same footprint that was occupied by a seawall and plant one small strip of vegetation and receive the same benefits, right?
Everyone likes progress. No one likes change. A follow-on question. Marshes are known to be carbon sinks, but is that carbon released during storms? And is there anything you can tell us about that?
Yeah, my experience is more carbon is usually sequestered during storms. It really has to do with, you know, what is the impact to that particular marsh during the storm? So if the marsh is eroded, for instance, then any of the carbon that was stored in the sediments that were eroded is then, you know, released back into the environment. It may be just going to be sequestered elsewhere. But if, for instance, the marsh is acting as an agent of accretion, then more sediments are burying that carbon, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does to me. Hopefully to the person that asked the question, it as well. Oh, another question has come in, I believe. Yes, straight from the Q&A, not copied. Is there a concern of introducing species, oysters or other vegetation, introduced species, changing the ecosystem that would not normally be found in that area, used to reduce erosion? So are you seeing introduction of species as a problem?
Not really. So one of the very first rules of designing with natural infrastructure is look to what already exists in the ecosystem, because if it already exists there, it has had that evolutionary advantage of adapting to that particular disturbance regime. It's going to be more effective. It's going to last longer. So yeah, there's really not a strong push to bring in non-native species. That's something that is kind of seen as counterproductive and probably not going to make a very good, robust design.
The questions are still flowing in, so thanks for sticking with us, and thanks everyone for these great questions. This question is a question, and also I think a little bit of a kudo. Rebecca Davis says, and I'm saying the name because this might be someone you want to get in touch with. I actually chose a hybrid approach for a residential river wall to preserve our coastline on the Tomaka, and tiered it, to hold the plants to continue to feed the manatee that visit, as the plants were being washed away with the land during recent flood events. So any comment? Thanks, Rebecca, for that. Any comment, Kelly?
So I'm sorry, can I clarify, was the area was eroding and now it's not, or it was restored and now the restoration is eroding?
I don't know.
Okay.
So yes, sorry, I believe that the hybrid approach was taken because plants were being washed away with the land during recent flood events. So I believe Rebecca then chose to use this hybrid approach to try to protect the coast, the shoreline.
Okay.
Oh.
Yep, so that's kind of the utility of being able to understand what the hydrodynamic thresholds of various species might be. So if you could have predicted a priori, okay, that this particular species was not going to be able to withstand that site, then maybe we could have looked at a hybrid approach from the beginning, right? So that's what I mean when I say that we're really at the infancy of design with living materials. We don't understand these things yet, but we really need to if we're going to do robust and cost-effective designs.
Thank you for that. Rebecca actually follows up, was eroding, not now. So it's
okay. Perfect. Perfect.
That's awesome. Again, bouncing back and forth here. This is possibly a suggestion, and maybe the answer is yes. Do you work or collaborate with Kate Orff? If not, we're going to give you Kate's number, and not number, her website, and I'll share that with you. Perhaps someone for future collaborations with your work.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And checking one more time, we have 3 minutes left. If there's any other questions for Dr. Kibler, we'd be happy to take them here. I think maybe we asked about saltwater intrusion. Have you ever studied the Anastasia coquina formation?
I have not. Is it something I should look into?
I don't know. Perhaps it is. Sorry, there was a question, and I'm going to butcher this. I can't find where's okay. Are you using halophytes in your design, native halophytes?
Well, yes. So I guess I have to ask a clarifying question. This is like salt warts? Excuse me, I'm not an ecologist.
I don't know either because I study people.
Okay, so halophytes, I would assume are, vegetation that has been adapted to saline conditions. So in that.
Okay, there is this whole chat thing is working well. Carrie Roach follows up and says and states salt-loving plants.
Salt-loving plants, yes, absolutely.
Another follow-up: do you use drones in any of your research, and can you tell us about the use of drones? And
I don't personally use drones. However, I love getting data from drones because it's amazing to be able to get that kind of landscape geographic perspective, especially the capabilities of being able to understand how a site is evolving over time. So yeah, if anybody is out there using the drones and wants to apply what they do to coastal restoration and natural infrastructure, please hit me up because I would love to do that.
All right, with 1 minute, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and say, Dr. Kibler, you are doing awesome things, and you're bringing new meaning to the term coastal defense with your upcoming work with DARPA. I am still looking forward to that day where I get to get out with you on the water. And I'd like to first thank you again for all this awesome research and the real impact, I think, which will be measured in the future on sustainable coastal systems around Florida and United States and the world. So I'd like to again thank you there and go on to say to everyone, thanks for attending the meeting. We hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. Please join us again on our next Lunch on the Coast, which will be Tuesday, November 9th, 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern Central Time, in which we will hear from Dr. Lisa Chambers, one of Dr. Kibler's co-PIs on several projects, on coastal soil carbon, feast or famine. So Tuesday, November 9th at noon, we'll see you here again. Thanks again, Dr. Kibler, and take care, everybody.